History teaches us that unity is strength, and cautions us to submerge and overcome our differences in the quest for common goals, to strive, with all our combined strength, for the path to true African brotherhood and unity. We have our own history, our own language, our own culture. But our destiny is also tied up with the destinies of other people. History has made us all South Africans. If I were not African, I wonder whether it would be clear to me that Africa is a place where the people do not need limp gifts of fish but sturdy fishing rods and fair access to the pond. I wonder whether I would realize that while African nations have a failure of leadership, they also have dynamic people with agency and voices. We must never forget that Black history is American history. The achievements of African Americans have contributed to our nation's greatness. The African is my brother, but he is my younger brother by several centuries. African art is functional, it serves a purpose. It's not adornment. It's not a means to collect the largest cheering section. It should be healing, a source of joy, spreading positive vibrations. The white man is not indigenous to Africa. Africa is for Africans. Zimbabwe is for Zimbabweans. An oligarchy of race, where the Saxon rules the African, might be endured, but this oligarchy of sex which makes father, brothers, husband, sons, the oligarchs over the mother and sisters, the wife and daughters of every household, carries discord and rebellion into every home of the nation. On the first day of school, my teacher, Miss Mdingane, gave each of us an English name and said that from thenceforth that was the name we would answer to in school. This was the custom among Africans in those days and was undoubtedly due to the British bias of our education. Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad. Weak minds exaggerate too much the wrong done to the Africans. First of all, the music that people call Latin or Spanish is really African. So Black people need to get the credit for that. Africans in the United States must remember that the slave ships brought no West Indians, no Caribbeans, no Jamaicans or Trinidadians or Barbadians to this hemisphere. The slave ships brought only African people, and most of us took the semblance of nationality from the places where slave ships dropped us off. I'm sickened by all religions. Religion has divided people. I don't think there's any difference between the Pope wearing a large hat and parading around with a smoking purse and an African painting his face white and praying to a rock. I was born in South Africa during apartheid, a system of laws that made it illegal for people to mix in South Africa. And this was obviously awkward because I grew up in a mixed family. My mother's a Black woman, South African Xhosa woman, and my father's Swiss, from Switzerland. I used to work in the cotton fields a lot when I was young. There were a lot of African Americans working out there. A lot of Mexicans, the blacks and the whites and the Mexicans, all out there singing, and it was like an opera in the cotton fields, and I can still hear it in the music that I write and play today. African women in general need to know that it's okay for them to be the way they are, to see the way they are as a strength, and to be liberated from fear and from silence. The sad truth is that without complex business partnerships between African elites and European traders and commercial agents, the slave trade to the New World would have been impossible, at least on the scale it occurred. The Great Migration can get forgotten if we don't pay attention or bear witness to it. It's part of my personal history and the history of millions of African Americans who left those oppressive conditions for better lives in the North. It's important to put that on the page. We're all Africans, everyone, black, white, yellow. The most valuable blacks are those in prison, those who have the warrior spirit, who had a sense of being African. They got for their women and children what they needed, and all other avenues were closed to them. When we say, look, Donald Trump was a friend to hip-hop back in the day, so was Bill Clinton, it doesn't mean that because he was a friend to hip-hop back in the day, that the same Bill Clinton wasn't at the lead of this mass incarceration of African Americans today. Geography was the lesson I always looked forward to most. It was a form of escapism. It could be bleak midwinter outside, but inside you're learning about African farming methods or the Great Lakes. No other lesson had that excitement. Africans who immigrate to America know how little racism exists there. They suspect it before emigrating from Africa, and they know it after arriving in America. Indeed, America, the left's depiction of it notwithstanding, is the least racist country in the world. Cassius Clay is a name that white people gave to my slave master. Now that I am free, that I don't belong anymore to anyone, that I'm not a slave anymore, I gave back their white name, and I chose a beautiful African one. Genius is an African who dreams up snow. I didn't really want to be a teacher, but there was nothing else I could be. Most of those who went to the university became teachers. It was just the racial restriction on Africans. My African heritage is a part of reggae music roots, and the concept is that the album, Revelation Part 1, The Root of Life, is a tribute to roots reggae music. The fruit is what blossoms into different colors and shades, but the root has to stand predominant. The Europeans not only colonialized most of the world, they began to colonialize information about the world and its people. In order to do this, they had to forget, or pretend to forget, all they had previously known about the Africans. If I know a song of Africa, of the giraffe and the African new moon lying on her back, of the plows in the fields and the sweaty faces of the coffee pickers, does Africa know a song of me? Our daily deeds as ordinary South Africans must produce an actual South African reality that will reinforce humanity's belief in justice, strengthen its confidence in the nobility of the human soul, and sustain all our hopes for a glorious life for all. I have a pet lizard named Puff, 5 goldfish, named Pinky, Brain, Jowls, Pearl and Sandy, an Oscar fish named Chef, 2 pacus, an albino African frog named Whitey, a bonsai tree, 4 Venus flytraps, a fruit fly farm and sea monkeys. There was always music in our home. My mom and my dad loved music. I remember when we were kids we would have these great parties at the house with congas and bongos and African drums, and it was amazing. It wasn't until years later that I found out that they were actually Black Panther meetings. I rebel at the notion that I can't be part of other groups, that I can't construct identities through elective affinity, that race must be the most important thing about me. Is that what I want on my gravestone? Here lies an African American. The last 400 or 500 years of European contact with Africa produced a body of literature that presented Africa in a very bad light and Africans in very lurid terms. The reason for this had to do with the need to justify the slave trade and slavery. There are a few elements, especially platinum and palladium, that have the amazing ability to absorb up to 900 times their own volume in hydrogen gas. To get a sense of the scale there, that's roughly equivalent to a 250-pound man swallowing something the size of a dozen African bull elephants and not gaining an inch on his waistline. The beautiful things that heaven bears is very much about America. It just happens to have African and Ethiopian characters, and in fact, it happens to have more characters who are not Ethiopian than who are. I'm not British. I'm not American. I'm not French. Whatever thing they practice, that is their business. I am an African. I am one these. Africa shares with Asia a common background of colonialism, of exploitation, of discrimination, of oppression. At Bandung, African and Asian states dedicated themselves to the liberation of their two continents from foreign domination and affirmed the right of all nations to develop in their own way, free of any external interference. I mean, in the South African case, many of those who were part of death squads would have been respectable members of their white community, people who went to church on Sunday, every Sunday. Black English is simpler than Standard English in some ways. For example, it often gets by with just be and drops am, is, and are. That's because Black English arose when adult African slaves learned the language. My mother is half French, half Malagasy, so I've been listening to African music, like Malian and Congolese music, since I was a child. People called rock roll African music. They called it voodoo music. They said that it would drive the kids insane. They said that it was just a flash in the pan, the same thing that they always used to say about hip-hop. As long as white people put people of color, African Americans and Latinos, in the same dispensable bag, and look at our children of color as insignificant and treat women of color as not as deserving of protection as white women, we will never achieve true equality.